You open your eyes and find yourself facing dozens of bearded men, armed to the teeth, staring at you like you're a fresh piece of meat. The smell is nauseating, a mix of rancid sweat, urine, feces, and rotten fish that would make you vomit instantly. But that would only be the first of many reactions your modern body would have in such a hostile environment. The truth is, even if you were physically strong and mentally prepared, you probably wouldn't survive even the first 24 hours aboard a genuine pirate ship. And I'm not just talking about obvious dangers like naval battles or walking the plank. I'm referring to the most basic and brutal aspects of maritime life that Hollywood never showed. But before explaining why your death would be almost certain, I need to ask you a disturbing question. Do you really know the difference between a movie pirate and a real pirate? Because that difference might be the key to understanding why so many men, even the bravest of their time, preferred facing the gallows over spending another day sailing under the black flag. The first thing that would kill you wouldn't be a sword or a cannon shot. It would be something much simpler and more terrifying: the food, or rather the lack of it. Pirate ships didn't have refrigerators, cooling systems, or any efficient way to preserve food. The meat they carried would rot in a matter of days under the blazing Caribbean sun. But here's the macabre detail: they ate it anyway. Thomas Anstis, a pirate who sailed the Atlantic between 1718 and 1723, left detailed records about the food conditions on board. According to his reports, salted pork became so infested with worms that pirates had to eat it in the dark so they wouldn't see what they were chewing. Nautical biscuits, known as hardtack, were so hard they had to be broken with hammers, and even then they were full of weevils and larvae. Can you imagine trying to swallow that? Your modern stomach, used to fresh and sanitized food, would collapse completely. Food poisoning would be inevitable, and without modern antibiotics, a simple diarrhea could kill you within hours due to dehydration. But let's suppose by some miracle you managed to keep the rotten food down. The next challenge would be something even more basic: water. Fresh water on pirate ships was stored in wooden barrels for weeks or even months. Without chemical treatment, this water became a broth of deadly bacteria. The color would often range from yellow to green, and the taste, well, the pirates themselves described it as worse than goat urine. That's why pirates mainly drank rum and beer. Not for fun, but out of survival necessity. The alcohol killed some bacteria and made the liquid at least tolerable. But here's the problem. You, as a 21st century person, don't have the alcohol tolerance of a 17th century sailor. While they could drink liters of diluted rum and keep functioning, you'd probably pass out or suffer severe alcohol poisoning within hours. And if you tried to drink only the plain water, dysentery would be almost guaranteed. Bartholomew Roberts, one of history's most famous pirates, lost more than half his crew not in battles, but due to waterborne diseases during a single voyage between 1719 and 1720. Now, let's talk about something that might seem trivial but would become your worst nightmare: the bathroom. Or rather, the complete absence of bathrooms as we know them. Pirate ships didn't have proper sanitary facilities. The bathroom consisted of a few holes made in the bow deck, called heads, where you relieved yourself directly into the sea. Sounds simple? Think again. These holes were exposed to wind, rain, and waves. During storms, they were literally unusable. Imagine trying to keep your balance on a violently rocking ship while trying to relieve yourself on a wet, slippery hole, with the constant risk of falling into the ocean and being eaten by sharks. Many pirates, especially rookies, preferred to soil their own clothes rather than risk their lives going to the heads during bad weather. This created a vicious cycle of disease and infections that killed more pirates than any naval battle. But maybe you're thinking, if I get past the first obstacles, maybe I'll adapt. Here's where things get even darker. The social structure of a pirate ship was based on constant violence and brutal hierarchy. As a newbie, you would automatically be placed at the very bottom of the pirate social ladder. That means you would get the worst tasks, the worst food, the worst sleeping spot, and be the first sacrificed in any dangerous situation. Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard, used to test new crew members by forcing them to fight to the death against other rookies. The losers were thrown to the sharks still alive. Violence wasn't occasional, It was constant and systematic. Veteran. Pirates had the right to beat, humiliate, and even kill rookies, for any reason they deemed valid. John Rackham, famous for having female pirates in his crew, maintained a tradition where new members were beaten by the entire crew during their first month on board, not as punishment, but as a rite of initiation. Do you really believe you could survive that level of physical and psychological brutality? And remember, there was no law, no appeal, no place to run. You were completely at the mercy of men who had chosen a life outside any civilized moral code. But let's assume, by some miracle, you survived the initial violence. The next challenge would be something most people don't even consider: physical labor. Life on a pirate ship demanded extreme physical strength and endurance that simply don't exist in the modern world. Hoisting the sails of a captured Spanish galleon required dozens of men pulling ropes weighing hundreds of kilos. Without cranes or any mechanical equipment, everything depended on brute strength. Pirates worked 18 to 20 hours a day during long voyages, with only a few hours of irregular sleep. Henry Morgan, one of the most famous 17th century privateers, documented that his men often fainted from exhaustion during complex maneuvers. Those who couldn't keep up were simply abandoned on the next deserted island, a near-certain death sentence. Your modern muscles, used to gyms and controlled exercises, wouldn't have the specific endurance required for that kind of brutal, constant labor. Within a few hours, your hands would be raw flesh, your muscles spasming, and your body in total collapse. And so we arrive at an aspect that is rarely discussed: diseases. Pirate ships were veritable laboratories of deadly pathogens. Without knowledge of basic hygiene, bacteria and viruses spread like wildfire. Scurvy was just the beginning, a disease that made your teeth fall out and your skin slowly rot away. But there were worse things. Syphilis was present on virtually every pirate ship, spread through prostitutes at the ports. Tuberculosis killed pirates by the dozens in the damp, poorly ventilated holds. Lice, fleas, and ticks carried diseases that had no names at the time, but that we now know were potentially fatal. Edward Lowe, a notoriously cruel pirate, lost 80% of his initial crew in just 6 months, not in battles, but due to a yellow fever epidemic that swept his ship in 1722. Bodies were thrown into the sea daily, creating a trail of corpses that attracted sharks for weeks. Your modern immune system, despite being superior in many ways, would have no defenses against these maritime-specific diseases. You would be exposed to pathogens that simply no longer exist in the civilized world, and death by disease would be almost certain within days. But perhaps the most terrifying aspect of pirate life was something completely psychological. Mental isolation. Imagine being surrounded by hundreds of miles of ocean, with no hope of escape, living among men who saw violence and death as daily entertainment. Charles Vane, a pirate operating in the Caribbean between 1716 and 1720, kept a diary describing how new crew members often went insane within weeks. Some threw themselves into the sea at night. Others tried to attack veteran crew members in psychotic episodes, only to be executed immediately. The constant psychological pressure of living under the threat of death, combined with confinement in a small space with dozens of violent men, created an environment that destroyed minds even trained for war. Royal Navy sailors, accustomed to rigid military discipline, often suffered mental breakdowns when forced to serve on pirate ships. You, accustomed to the privacy, safety, and predictability of modern life, would face a psychological shock that could kill you even before any disease or physical violence had a chance, and we haven't even talked about the most obvious dangers. Naval battles were not elegant duels like in the movies. They were bloody massacres where men were literally torn apart by cannonballs. But even the most routine pirate activities were deadly dangerous. Boarding an enemy ship meant jumping between moving vessels, often during storms, carrying heavy weapons, and trying not to be cut in half by a sword or pierced by a spear. The mortality rate during boarding actions was about 40%. Nearly half the pirates involved died in each attack. Black Sam Bellamy, considered one of the most successful pirates of his time, lost 200 men in just 18 months of piracy, a rate of over 10 deaths per month, and that was during a period considered quiet by pirate standards. But here's the most disturbing detail. Even if you managed to survive all these horrors, there would still be one last, nearly insurmountable obstacle. Betrayal was a constant in pirate life. There was no real loyalty, only temporary alliances based on fear and mutual interest. Anne Bonny and Mary Red, the most famous female pirates in history, were betrayed by their own crew in exchange for pardons from the English government. Calico Jack Rackham was handed over to authorities by a crew member who wanted his reward. As a newcomer without established allies, you would be the first to be sacrificed in any negotiation. Your life would be worth less than a barrel of rum or a handful of gold coins. The constant paranoia necessary to survive in an environment where anyone could kill you for any reason would quickly destroy your mental sanity. So, let's recap. In your first 24 hours aboard a real pirate ship, you would face severe food poisoning, dehydration from contaminated water, extreme physical violence, exhaustion from brutal labor, exposure to deadly diseases, psychological collapse, from isolation and pressure and betrayal by those you were forced to trust to survive. The reality is that pirate life was not a romantic adventure. It was a slow, brutal death sentence. The men who chose this life did so because their alternatives were even worse. Hunger, slavery, prison, or immediate execution. They were not adventurous heroes. They were desperate men who preferred to die fighting at sea rather than die slowly on land. The next time you watch a pirate movie and wonder what it would be like to live that life, remember, you wouldn't last even 24 hours. And maybe that's for the best, because those who lasted longer often found there were fates far worse than a quick death. The real history of piracy is written in blood, disease, and despair, not adventure and romance. And that is a truth Hollywood will never want you to discover.